On Tuesday of this week, and for a number of reasons, I began to feel that the message I'd been working on for today was not the direction God was calling me to go. By way of a confession, I woke that morning still angry with our governor's decision to reopen some of the businesses in our state that had no possibility of following the CDC protocols for distancing. And I was also distrustful of the motives behind the action. My anger was further complicated by a conversation with one of our local health department doctors, who confirmed that we are not able to offer widespread testing to asymptomatic people who could well be shedding the virus, which is a key factor in reopening things safely. Nor has the known infection rate been declining for 14 consecutive days. And so I was asking myself, is opening this way really a good idea? We might want to check with those overburdened doctors and nurses. And then on a parallel track, interactions with friends and family members were beginning to center on how confused, disillusioned, and even cynical they were becoming. We talk about being in this together, but there were reports of government assistance being allocated to million-dollar corporations and institutions with large endowments. People are losing the businesses they've worked their entire lives to establish. Paychecks no longer come, rent can't be paid, food insecurity is growing, and for the ones who live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to get by on minimum wage, even in the best of times, the implications are even more severe. Meanwhile, the death toll, with all its embedded racial bias, is continuing to rise. And so on Tuesday, I was deeply aware that people are desperate for some kind of trustworthy truth about this virus and its fallout, that they're hungering for genuine leadership that can acknowledge a problem and work to set a course for tackling it, and that they're done with mixed messages built on shifting sand of wishful thinking. When I say people, I really mean me. George Will, in his newest book, The Conservative Sensibility, retells a story of what has been referred to as the miracle at Dunkirk. In May and June of 1940, the Allied forces were stranded on a crowded French beach with the English Channel on one side and Nazi forces surrounding them on the other. They appeared to be doomed. In that moment, a British officer telegraphed London with a coded message as to their dire circumstance. The text said, "But if not." It's a quote from the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel that Brandon shared with us this morning. So on Tuesday, as I felt trapped between a viral army on one side and an angry economic sea on the other, with no one charting a course forward, this felt like a good place to look for a word from God. The first 6 chapters of Daniel contain what we could call hero stories. They promote action, they embolden faith, and in the case of chapter 3, they call people to nonviolent resistance to what the Interpreter's Bible calls the symbols of power and its religious expressions. The cast of characters includes Daniel, his 3 young friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel and his friends have gained position in the king's court, for they are wise and pious and trustworthy. But they are also deeply loyal to their covenant with Israel's God. The king, on the other hand, is representative of a system that derives its prestige and its power from the suffering of others. He's a wealthy tyrant, one who can afford to build a monument to himself for others to worship. Driven by jealousy, he surrounds himself with those who are constantly vying for his favor. The king commissions a golden statue and announces an unveiling celebration to which the highest officials of government are all invited. And as the music begins to play, the people are expected to bow before the statue. Sycophants swearing a living loyalty oath to their willingness to do their king's bidding. And when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to go along, on the strength of commandments 1 and 2 of the Big Ten, the king sentences them to death by fire. With a sarcasm that foreshadows Jesus before Pilate, he asks them, "Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" The 3 young men refuse to defend their actions. Instead, they respond with a calm solidarity and grounded identity. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. But if not. These are the words the British officer in the Dunkirk story telegraphed to London, a way of saying to them, even if God can't save us, we will stand firm and we will not capitulate to the Nazi regime. And the message was clear to those who received it because someone over at headquarters knew a story about 3 young men who stood firm for God, not because it was a magic bullet or a mantra by which to escape their reality, but because it was their duty to be faithful. Daniel Smith Christopher, writing in Interpreter's Bible, calls this clinging to faith a summons to political atheism. Our modern day Nebuchadnezzar, he says, is able to build statues with the face of Jesus. And it's easy for us to accept political or economic policies that involve bowing to golden statues in the name of national interest. But as Christians, we have a calling not to give in or to lose heart in the face of that kind of monumental self-importance of those who are in power. When the young men are thrown into the furnace, the heat is so high that those doing the throwing are consumed by it. And yet, as is often the case with hero stories, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not burned. Their willingness to die rather than capitulate means that the king's power to crush their integrity has been nullified. But before they exit the fire, there's one more element in the story. The king, it seems, is mystified as to why there appear to be 4 figures rather than 3 standing in the furnace amid the flames. Is this an angel? Is this perhaps the God of the Jews? Or is this a prefiguring of Jesus' resurrection story, with its defiant reversal of the Roman authorities' attempt to impose their will on a minority people? As with most hero stories, the details will stand apart from rational explanations. When it comes to the 4th figure, each of us is free to decide where we come down. But whatever the case, the king has no choice but to acknowledge the transcendent power of Israel's God. Our heroes have stayed the course, not because they had a guaranteed outcome, but for the sake of faithfulness. And God has delivered them, not as a reward for their willingness to die, but because God too is faithful. Last Tuesday, I needed to be reminded of God's faithfulness. And I needed to be reminded of my call to action in the face of these expressions of worldly power. Like the waters of the English Channel, the properties of a virus are a product of nature. We can flail our arms or sputter on about freedom and rights, but none of it will make the virus behave any differently from how viruses behave. We aren't helpless here, but we will need to be patient. We will need to wait for the gifts of science to be manifest, for proven medical interventions and vaccines. We'll need to build boats to get us to the other side of the channel, PPE and ventilators, testing capacity, financial assistance, maybe even higher taxes. We'll need to practice self-sacrifice for the sake of other people, staying at home much longer than we'd like, even as we wish for the human interactions that we all took for granted just a month ago. And we won't have the luxury of waiting to address all of the economic pressures until the virus has run its course. It really will be necessary for us to walk and chew gum. But we don't have to bow in the face of political pressure. And we don't have to worship an image of Jesus that has been pasted over policies that are inhumane and death-dealing. Even in the midst of the chaos, we can choose to be faithful. You know, I've not been able to find a clear, unbiased documentation of that British officer's telegram. I don't have a name or a specific date to attach to it. They're only articles that serve the purposes of those who wrote them. But there is documentation that as the evacuation of the beach at Dunkirk got underway, military vessels were joined by tugboats and trawlers, by drift boats and personal yachts. There was a crisis at hand, the stakes were high, so the community found a way to pull together to make a concentrated effort and a targeted response. As a result, lives were changed. Our world is crying out for a concentrated effort and a targeted response, not only to a virus, but also to self-serving, death-dealing business as usual that this virus has exposed. We may be surrounded on all sides by golden statues, but we are not obliged to bow and to worship. In fact, as Christians, our faith demands that we do exactly the opposite. Every day, Richard and I have made a point of watching Governor Cuomo of New York give his daily press briefing. And every day he closes his comments with a characterization of New Yorkers that is designed to encourage as well as to challenge. I find them to be good words for the church as we make our way through this crisis. We are New York tough, he says, and New York tough means being smart, disciplined, unified, and loving. As we go through the days that lie ahead, may the faithful of God find ways to be smart and disciplined and unified and loving. May we find ways to be New York tough.